You knew that we had to get back to Ghiberti. After all, we talked about that competition at the beginning of the chapter, the beginning of the section. So here we're going to look at really the high point of the doors that he's going to do for the baptistry. He does a couple of different sets, and these are the Gates of Paradise. So we return back to doors. And when we look at this, you'll notice that the design, the idea, is very different from what we saw with the sacrifice of Isaac. Now, Ghiberti is among the first artists to embrace a unified system for depicting perspective. What does that mean? That means that he's going to use both atmospheric as well as linear perspective. And this is his second set of doors for the building. The first is the east doors that were later moved to the north side to make room for the second set, which are what we're looking at. His second set abandoned the quatrefoil and reduced the number of panels from 28 to 10. Why do you want less panels? Well, that means I have a bigger working area, so I can tell a greater story. Each panel portrays a scene from the Old Testament. These panels also recall painting techniques in their depiction of space and their treatment of the narrative. For example, we see what's called a continuous narrative, or a method for telling multiple episodes from a story in a single work. We saw this with Pisano when we looked at the Annunciation, Annunciation, Nativity, and Adoration of the Shepherds earlier in the class. So we're seeing that here as well. He's going to take one story and give us multiple parts to it so that we can better relate, we can better understand. Once again, he also uses shallow engraving and detail to create a sense of atmospheric perspective to go along with the scientific or linear perspective that he's working with in the piece. And we're going to be focusing on Isaac and his sons by Ghiberti. This is one of those panels from the Gates of Paradise. Now here, Ghiberti retains the narrative method of depicting several images in a single frame. And what we see is the women in the foreground are there to attend the birth of Esau and Jacob happening in the background. In the central foreground, we see Isaac sending Esau and his dogs to hunt game. In the right foreground, Isaac blesses Jacob as Rebekah looks on. Now, as I move through this, the story is basically that of Isaac and his sons. So their birth, and then the other major story, which is passing on Isaac's blessing. And what happens is Esau is sent to hunt game and bring back Isaac some stew. Now, you have to understand, Isaac is blind at the time. Rebekah, Isaac's wife, will trick him because she favors the other son, Jacob. She will trick him by having Jacob put on a sheepskin, which is hairier because his brother Esau is hairier, and bringing Isaac stew so that he receives Isaac's blessing. And we get an idea of that as Esau throws down his staff and leaves the scene. We see what's going on throughout. And again, it's a bit of a teaching tool. It's going to help immensely. Now, we have linear or scientific perspective happening here. We see that in all of these receding lines. And they all come to more or less one vanishing point, which is exactly what they're supposed to do. It lends an air of credibility in the three-dimensionality of the scene. But it only works in man-made objects. After all, straight lines don't generally exist in nature. For that reason, he will go ahead and use atmospheric perspective, where things in the background, such as this tree, are barely etched in, very similar to Donatello's St. George. And so we see this tree barely etched in the background, this Esau a little bit deeper than the tree, a little bit higher relief, But then if you come over here to things in the immediate foreground, you'll notice these figures look like they could have been cast independently and simply glued onto the surface. They have such high relief that it stands in stark contrast. And we see the same thing with the figures in general. Any figure in the foreground is in very high relief. As you move into the background, you'll notice they get to the point of, for example, Rebecca giving birth and being barely etched in. So the combination of the two is what sets Ghiberti apart. He's using both linear and atmospheric perspective at the same time in the same piece to create that illusion of three-dimensionality, even though we know it's a two-dimensional surface. And in this case, it kind of is three-dimensional. We're in relief carving, but we're going to leave that one to the side for the moment. It kind of opens up yet another muddy territory, another can of worms. This would be sort of partially full relief, but we're not going to worry about that right now. Just worry about the fact that by including atmospheric and linear perspective, he creates something incredibly realistic for the time.